July 1979. Pinelands, Cape Town, an industrial suburb bordered by railway lines and silent warehouses. Morning mist hung low across the Cape Flats. The streets were empty, except for workers heading toward the station. Near a fenced service path, a man noticed something in the grass, a shape that broke the even line of ground. He stopped. Cold air drifted through the wire mesh as he leaned closer. Beyond the fence, a figure lay partly hidden beside a shallow trench. The stillness felt unnatural. He turned and ran to a nearby payphone to call police. Within minutes, a patrol van pulled onto the gravel verge. 2 constables marked a perimeter with tape from the rear compartment. The radio crackled faintly as they called in the discovery. A woman lay face down, one arm bent beneath her, hair damp from overnight fog, no pulse. The time was logged as 07:23. Detective Inspector Herman Venter from the Serious Crimes Unit arrived soon after. He had served in Cape Town for more than a decade, known for his patience with detail. He surveyed the scene without speaking. A single set of footprints led from the service road toward the body. Tire marks curved back toward the siding. Footsteps echoed softly as officers documented the impressions. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. A crime scene photographer unpacked his camera and tripod. Each flash cut briefly through the mist. The victim appeared to be in her early 20s, dressed in a torn white blouse and navy skirt. A narrow gold chain lay broken near her collarbone. Investigators collected 2 cigarette butts, a crushed matchbox, and a bus ticket stub, dated the previous evening, 18th of July 1979. Evidence was logged by hand. DNA analysis did not yet exist. Fibers and fingerprints were the limits of science. By 10 a.m., the body reached Salt River Mortuary. Inside the examination room, Dr. Ruth Naidu began the post-mortem. Under the dim fluorescent light, she documented bruising along the neck, consistent with manual strangulation. No weapon injuries appeared. Soil beneath the fingernails indicated struggle in loose sand, likely near railway maintenance ground. She signed her notes. Time of death, between 20 Tux and 22 June. That afternoon, Venter visited the Missing Persons Bureau. Several files matched the description, but one stood out. Lydia Marais, 21, pharmacy assistant, missing since Thursday evening. Her mother had already filed a report. When shown the recovered locket, she confirmed it immediately. An engraved letter L on the reverse. Identification was finalized through dental. Charting the following day, witness accounts placed Lydia at the observatory bus stop shortly before 18 n. She was seen speaking to a man in a tan jacket. The streetlight above the shelter flickered, blurring his features. The bus driver confirmed she never boarded. Detectives calculated a 15-minute window between her last sighting and probable abduction, a narrow frame that would define the case for decades. Officers canvassed shops and homes along Main Road. One vendor recalled a beige sedan idling near the curb around dusk. Another remembered a car door closing sharply. No license number was noted. Investigators mapped the short route from the pharmacy to the stop, measuring distances on foot. Still wind pressed against their coats as the temperature dropped toward evening. Laboratory results returned few leads. The cigarette butts carried no usable prints. Soil samples contained iron dust common to rail yards. The plaster cast of the footprint showed a military tread sold widely in surplus stores. Leads multiplied without focus. Each was logged, tested, and stored. By Sunday morning, newspapers carried the headline, "Young Woman Found Near Tracks. Police Seek Information." The printed photograph showed a police van under mist. Residents in Claremont, where Lydia had lived, placed flowers by her gate. Neighbors described her as quiet, dependable, close to her parents. The absence of motive unsettled detectives. Late that night, Venter reviewed photographs pinned across his office wall. The desk lamp cast dim light over the locket. He wrote a single note beneath the images, "No forced robbery, personal." Then he closed the file. Door hinges creaked softly as he left the room. Weeks passed. The grass near the siding grew back over disturbed soil. Only a faint outline remained. The case was labeled 79317, Marais, Lydia. Inside the archive envelope lay the bus ticket, matchbox, and broken chain. The investigation would continue for months before the trail cooled. Dust hung in the air as the cabinet drawer slid shut. Heavy silence followed. She attended a local convent school and later completed a pharmacy assistant course through a provincial training program. Her colleagues at the observatory pharmacy described her as punctual, reserved, and careful with detail. She handled patient prescriptions, balanced stock sheets, and rarely took leave. Sound from a passing train echoed faintly through the shop walls every hour, a reminder of the nearby line where she would later be found. Detective Inspector Herman Venter began reconstructing her final days. He started with her workplace records, cross-checking attendance logs and clock-out times. The entry for Thursday, 18th July, confirmed she left at 17:30. Her bus route required a short walk down Station Road, a narrow stretch lined with small shops. Witnesses said she stopped briefly at a corner cafe. The owner recalled her buying bread and 2 packets of headache powder before leaving. By comparing statements, Venter estimated that Lydia left the cafe at 17:40. The bus was due at 17:45. In winter, Cape Town's light faded quickly. Street lamps came on in short intervals, casting uneven shadows along the pavement. One lamp above the bus stop was reported faulty. When maintenance records were checked later, the repair log showed it had been reported flickering for several weeks. That technical note became a small but crucial detail in the file. The Serious Crimes Unit at the time operated from Caledon Square Police Headquarters. The building's hallways smelled faintly of polish and damp paper. Case files were logged manually in leather-bound registers. Typewriters clicked through each report, producing carbon copies for district distribution. Venter assigned 2 detectives, Constable Eric Daniels and Sergeant Willem Meiring, to assist with field inquiries. Their daily reports were filed in chronological order, each marked with a red ink stamp for receipt. In the first week, officers interviewed all employees from the pharmacy. No disputes, no unusual calls, no signs of harassment. Lydia's routine remained consistent: morning bus, work, short lunch, return home. She carried a simple handbag with a leather strap. It was missing from the crime scene. The only items recovered were those scattered near the trench, indicating she might have been grabbed suddenly, dropping what she held. The handbag was never found. A week later, Venter reviewed bus company timetables. The 17:45 line from Observatory to Claremont was confirmed on schedule that evening. The driver, a man named Willem Botha, recalled slowing at the stop but seeing no one waiting. He remembered the streetlight flickering and the mist forming low across the road. That weather matched meteorological reports from the Cape Town Observatory, confirming drizzle and limited visibility between 18 Sous and Danishi. The factual consistency strengthened the timeline. The team expanded the search radius to include side roads and open fields near the railway. They located several discarded beer bottles and a torn paper bag, but no trace of the missing handbag. Footsteps echoed in the underpass as they checked drainage channels for evidence. Nothing matched the forensic samples taken from Lydia's clothing. Soil granules from her shoes aligned with the service path where she was found, confirming she had been moved only a short distance before death. On the evening of 24th July, Venter met with Dr. Naidu to review the autopsy report. Toxicology returned negative for alcohol or sedatives. Stomach contents suggested she had eaten bread and tea roughly 1 hour before death, consistent with leaving work and buying food on her way home. No sexual assault was detected. Cause of death: manual strangulation. Estimated time of death remained between 20s and 22 soon. Venter closed the report folder quietly and noted, "Death occurred within 4 hours of abduction." Back at headquarters, a new witness approached police voluntarily. A rail guard named Francois Duprise reported seeing a beige sedan near the siding around 21:30 that night. He remembered its headlights turning off briefly as he passed. He assumed it belonged to maintenance staff and did not investigate. When shown photographs later, he described the car as possibly a Toyota Corona, common in Cape Town at the time. This description was circulated to garages and parts dealers across the city. The investigation now contained more than 100 witness statements. Each was transcribed onto index sheets and cross-referenced by location. The process was slow, entirely manual. Every night, the hum of typewriters filled the office as clerks duplicated notes for the district archive. Cigarette smoke hung in the air above their desks. Forensic reports arrived by courier in sealed brown envelopes. Inside, typed summaries described each fiber, soil sample, and chemical test in plain technical language. Two factual anchors stood out. First, the footprint cast from the scene matched a size 8 military boot, imported surplus stock sold primarily through outdoor suppliers along Voortrekker Road. Second, a partial fingerprint was recovered from the inside of the matchbox found near the body. The ridge pattern was faint, lacking comparison value, but it was preserved on acetate film for future reference. The report concluded with a line typical of the era: retention recommended, possible future methods may yield identification. At the time, future methods referred only to improved chemical lifting, not yet DNA profiling. The concept of storing biological evidence for later reanalysis had only begun in major European cities. In South Africa, such practice was rare. Venter made a personal note instructing that the cigarette butts and matchbox remain sealed and frozen for preservation. That decision would become important decades later. As weeks turned into months, public attention faded. Another case in the northern suburbs drew headlines, diverting resources. Lydia's file moved to a lower priority category. Venter and his team continued part-time on evenings and weekends, reviewing leads that arrived by mail. One envelope contained an anonymous note claiming knowledge of a man with a tan jacket seen near the station. The handwriting was uneven, the paper folded twice. No signature. No follow-up ever traced it. The Marais family visited the station weekly. Lydia's father sat in the waiting area, holding a small folder of photographs. Each meeting ended the same way: quiet thanks, then a slow walk back to the car. The heavy silence that followed those visits stayed with the detectives. In his private notes, Venter wrote that the case should not be forgotten even if it remains unsolved. Cold air pressed against the window as he signed the entry. By December, winter had passed. Grass along the service path stood dry and tall again. Local children played cricket nearby without noticing the faint discoloration of soil where the body had been found. Forensics from the last set of samples produced nothing new. The crime scene photographs were catalogued and placed in acid-free envelopes. The negative strips went into a locked cabinet marked pending. The key hung on a single hook above the evidence clerk's desk. When the file was reviewed in early 1980, senior officers recommended closure pending new evidence. Venter protested, citing unresolved witness contradictions and the missing handbag. He was overruled. The official note read, "Case suspended, insufficient leads." The file joined hundreds of others in the regional archive, boxed and numbered. Dust settled on the shelf as the air grew still. Years later, officers would recall how thorough the initial documentation had been. Every measurement, every soil sample, every contact sheet preserved in meticulous order. It was an era before digitization, when handwriting carried the full weight of an investigation. That discipline, overlooked then, would one day allow the case to reopen. By early 1980, the Marais file occupied a full drawer in the Caledon Square evidence room. Photographs, typed transcripts, and forensic slips filled 3 brown folders. The edges of each page had begun to yellow slightly. Fluorescent tubes hummed above the desks where junior detectives catalogued the backlog. Heavy silence settled whenever Venter entered the room. He began reviewing every statement for discrepancies. One entry stood out. The cafe owner had mentioned a man in a tan jacket paying for matches minutes before Lydia bought bread. The detail had not been followed up. Venter dispatched Sergeant Mayring to locate that customer. Receipts from the till showed 2 purchases within 3 minutes. The matches were a brand sold mainly to smokers who preferred non-filtered cigarettes, identical to the butts found at the scene. A local wholesaler confirmed selling that same batch to several small stores, including one near the Wynberg bus terminal. The distribution records were paper-based, stamped in purple ink. When Venter examined them under the dim office light, he saw the date, 17th July 1979, one day before the murder. The forensic connection was circumstantial but specific enough to justify new interviews. Constable Daniels canvassed the Wynberg area, checking small pubs and garages. Many patrons wore tan work jackets. The detail was too common to isolate. In one bar, a mechanic recalled a man who smoked Texan plain cigarettes and drove an older beige Toyota. He was said to be quiet, always watching. The mechanic thought his name might be Peter. The description was logged carefully. The sound of a typewriter carriage return marked each new line of report. The vehicle registry listed 214 beige Toyotas registered in Cape Town that year. Of those, 7 belonged to individuals named Peter. Each was cross-checked against employment records. One Peter Nell worked for a rail maintenance subcontractor with access to the siding near Pinelands. He was 27, unmarried, lived alone in Goodwood, and owned boots consistent with the tread photographed at the scene. The file began to focus. When detectives visited his flat, Nell answered calmly. He allowed them inside without resistance. The small living room smelled faintly of oil and tobacco. A pair of worn military-style boots stood near the door. On the table lay an ashtray filled with Texan plain butts. Venter noted the observation silently. The officers requested that Nell accompany them to headquarters for a voluntary interview. At the station, he stated he had been on night duty during the time of the murder, repairing track points at Maitland. The crew log, however, showed his shift beginning at 22 GI, not earlier. That left an unaccounted gap of nearly 4 hours. He claimed to have spent that time at home preparing equipment. Investigators inspected his boots. The soles matched the general pattern found near the trench, but lacked any distinct wear mark to confirm identification. The sample was photographed and sealed. Forensic analysts compared fibers from Nell's car upholstery with those from Lydia's blouse. The laboratory, equipped with a simple optical comparator, identified a possible similarity in weave type, synthetic orange nylon. Still, without microspectral testing, unavailable locally then, the finding was marked inconclusive. Cold air drifted through the open window of the analysis room as technicians worked late into the night. Weeks turned to months. Venter pressed for a search warrant but was denied. Evidence remained circumstantial. Nell's supervisor vouched for his reliability. Without confession or physical proof, the file could not advance. The investigation entered what the unit called maintenance phase, minimal activity annual review. The case lingered on the shelf. By mid-1981, Venter was reassigned to new duties. Before leaving, he wrote a memo urging that key samples be preserved indefinitely. Among them, the cigarette ends, the matchbox film, and clothing fibers. He believed new techniques would one day clarify them. The memo bore his signature and the date, 12th of June 1981. The cabinet door creaked softly as the clerk filed it away. Years passed. The evidence boxes moved twice, first during office renovations and later to a central archive in Belleville. Labels faded, handwriting blurred. Files from the late 1970s were rarely opened. Yet the Marais case survived intact, thanks to Venter's memo. Each envelope remained sealed under wax stamps, still visible beneath dust. By the 1990s, forensic science in South Africa had changed. The newly formed National Laboratory System introduced early DNA sequencing, though capacity was limited. Old cases were sometimes reviewed if physical material remained viable. In 1997, a junior analyst named Elmarie Stein discovered the Marais file while cataloging legacy evidence. The box still contained the 2 cigarette ends and a cloth swab from the locket chain. She recorded the find in a digital index for possible future testing. The hum of refrigeration units echoed faintly in the storage room. The case resurfaced formally in 2001, when a national cold case initiative began under the newly created Forensic Science Services Division. Files were prioritized by available biological samples. Lydia Marais ranked high because of the preserved evidence and original documentation quality. The cigarette filters were re-examined using updated extraction methods. Technicians worked under sterile laminar flow hoods, scraping trace material into microtubes. The air smelled faintly of ethanol and plastic. Initial results were partial but significant. A low-yield male DNA profile recovered from one cigarette end. It was entered into the South African DNA reference system, which then contained only a few thousand profiles, mostly from convicted offenders. No match appeared. The analyst recommended retention and periodic rerun as the database expanded. Her report ended, "Sample integrity good. Resubmit every 5 years." In 2005, advances in mitochondrial sequencing allowed deeper analysis. Scientists reprocessed both cigarette ends, yielding a clearer genetic profile. By then, Herman Venter had retired, living quietly near Stellenbosch. When contacted for consultation, he provided his old field notebooks. His handwriting, small and deliberate, filled dozens of pages. Under one entry he had written, "Subject possibly rail worker, access to siding confirmed." The note aligned precisely with the suspect once named, Peter Nel, whose whereabouts were now uncertain. Investigators traced Nel through employment records. He had emigrated briefly to Namibia in the 1980s. Returning to South Africa after 1994, he now operated a small mechanical workshop outside Worcester. When detectives from the cold case unit arrived unannounced, he appeared cooperative. He admitted to knowing the area near Pinelands, but denied any connection to Lydia Marais. He consented to a voluntary DNA swab. The sample was sent to the National Lab under chain of custody form FSD-42. Weeks later, results arrived. The male profile from the 1979 cigarette matched Peter Nell's DNA with a probability of 1 in 13 billion. The confirmation process was repeated independently by 2 analysts. Both reported identical outcomes. Inside the lab, footsteps echoed across the tiled floor as technicians double-checked documentation. Every link in the custody chain was intact from 1979 to 2005, an extraordinary rarity. An arrest warrant was issued quietly. Officers approached Nell at his workshop one morning in August 2005. The wind pressed against the corrugated iron walls as they read him his rights. He appeared calm, offering no resistance. Tools lay scattered on the bench beside him. Grease marked his hands. He simply nodded and asked to call his lawyer. At headquarters, Nell was interviewed under caution. He denied smoking the brand in question, claimed he had quit years before the murder. When confronted with the DNA report, he stared at the paper without speaking. After several minutes, he requested water. The tape hissed softly as the recorder continued. Eventually, he said only, "I used to smoke when I was young. That doesn't mean I killed her." The statement ended there. Prosecutors reviewed the file for admissibility. Every sample, label, and seal had been verified. The cigarette butt was proven to have been collected at the crime scene in 1979, handled only by authorized technicians. Chain of custody documents carried signatures across 26 years. The evidence was considered legally sound. A new charge sheet was drafted. Murder, case 79-317, State versus Peter Johannes Nel. Venter was informed by letter. He visited the Belleville station one last time to see the updated file. Dust in the air glimmered under fluorescent light. He read through the pages slowly, recognizing his own handwriting in the early reports. He said little. When leaving, he remarked quietly to the officer beside him, "It took half a lifetime, but at least the paper survived." His words were recorded in the case log, verbatim. Nell's first court appearance was brief. The magistrate ordered him held pending trial. Public interest reignited. Newspapers ran retrospectives titled, "The Pinelands Case Reopened." Television reporters stood outside the courthouse as rain fell lightly on their microphones. Viewers heard the story of a file preserved through decades of neglect, and of a cigarette butt that had carried an answer across time. Forensic experts later testified to the chain of custody procedure that saved the evidence. They described the old wax seals, the manual signatures, the typed memos from 1981. It was those small administrative details, not new technology alone, that ensured the DNA remained admissible. Heavy silence filled the courtroom as photographs of the original scene appeared on the screen. As the investigation reached this point, public memory of Lydia Marais shifted from victim to symbol of persistence. Her parents had long since passed away. Only her brother, now living in George, attended the hearings. He sat quietly near the back, a photograph folded in his pocket. When asked by journalists how he felt, he said only, "It's been too long to feel anything, but she can rest now." The statement was printed in the Cape Argus the next morning. Outside, cold wind moved through the courthouse parking lot. Officers packed files into marked boxes for transfer to the state advocate's office. The Marais case, once forgotten, now stood at the threshold of closure. When the news broke of the arrest in 2005, the Marais family name reappeared in headlines that had once faded into history. For many residents of Claremont, the story was a distant echo from another time. Some remembered the day Lydia vanished. Others had grown up hearing quiet mentions of the girl by the tracks. A local reporter revisited the site where the body had been found. Grass had grown high along the old fence, the railway line still active but modernized. The wind pressed gently against the chain link as she stood recording ambient sound. In the Marais household, only Lydia's brother, Anton, remained. Their parents had both died in the 1990s. The house itself looked almost unchanged from photographs in the original file. Low walls, faded green shutters, a narrow front path lined with stones. Inside, dust hung in the air where light filtered through the curtains. Anton kept his sister's locket in a small box on a shelf. The clasp had been repaired once, the engraved letter L still visible. He declined most interviews, speaking briefly to one newspaper only after the first court appearance. His statement was measured. "This is not closure, but it's something solid." Those words resonated widely. Across Cape Town, readers left comments about how long justice could sleep. For many, the case illustrated both the failures and endurance of the system, a reminder that files do not always vanish even when attention does. Detectives who had worked under Benter in the 1970s visited him after the arrest. They found him seated on the veranda of his small house outside Stellenbosch, a stack of newspapers beside him. He had aged, his voice slower, but his memory exact. He told them he had kept copies of certain reports at home for decades, not out of mistrust, but caution. The rustle of pages carried in the quiet breeze as he turned them carefully. "It wasn't luck," he said softly. "It was record-keeping." The broader policing community saw the case as a validation of persistence. Within the Forensic Science Services Division, it became an internal training example. Technicians discussed how simple procedural discipline, properly labeled samples, sealed envelopes, consistent handwriting, could bridge generations of technology. A faint hum from refrigeration units filled the lab as instructors pointed to the old Marais file preserved on digital display. Students leaned closer to see the original ink signatures from 1979. In Claremont, public reaction was subdued. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over 25 years. New families occupied houses once belonging to the Marais neighbors. Few had personal memories of the event. Yet when the local paper reprinted the 1979 headline, some older residents recognized the photograph immediately. One woman told a journalist she had stopped letting her daughters walk home alone after that year. The remark captured the quiet shift in fear that had lingered long after the case itself had cooled. The cafe where Lydia bought her last bread no longer existed. The building had become a small electronics shop, its exterior repainted. When the owner learned of the location's connection, he placed a small framed clipping of the old article near the counter. Customers often paused to read it. Footsteps echoed softly on the tiled floor as people moved past. Most left without comment, but the story stayed in local conversation for weeks. For Lydia's former co-workers, the news reopened memories long set aside. Several were retired, living in other provinces. One, interviewed by a radio program, recalled how Lydia kept her workspace orderly and always double-checked labels on prescriptions. "She didn't talk much," the woman said, "but you could rely on her." The host let the silence linger for several seconds before continuing. The tape hissed faintly in the background. In churches and community halls, discussions about unsolved crimes resurfaced. Pastors spoke about patience and perseverance. Social workers used the Marais case to illustrate the importance of victim advocacy and record preservation. The themes of delay, evidence integrity, and family endurance became part of a wider conversation about cold cases. The sound of chairs scraping across wooden floors echoed as audiences gathered for evening talks. At a memorial service organized by a local civic group, a small plaque was unveiled near the railway siding where the body had been found. The inscription read simply, "In remembrance of Lydia Marais, 1958-1979, may diligence keep the lost from being forgotten." Cold air drifted from the open field as attendees stood in silence. No speeches followed, only a brief prayer and the quiet shuffle of feet leaving the site. For those within the forensic community, the case also prompted introspection. A senior analyst at the National Laboratory stated during a seminar that technology alone doesn't solve old crimes. It only helps those who once cared enough to preserve them. The line circulated widely in internal memos. The Marais evidence box was displayed temporarily in a secure viewing area. Gloves required, no photography allowed. Under the glass lay the 2 cigarette butts, the matchbox acetate film, and the handwritten memo signed by Venter in 1981. The labels, faded but legible, bore the same case number that had once nearly been lost to storage rotation. Meanwhile, the media coverage produced mixed emotions among Cape Town residents. Some celebrated the eventual arrest. Others questioned why such resolution required 3 decades. Editorials cited underfunded laboratories, outdated storage conditions, and bureaucratic delay. Policymakers discussed reforms to preserve evidence indefinitely in major cases. The atmosphere in government offices was pragmatic rather than celebratory. The sound of printers ran late into the night as draft legislation circulated. At the University of Cape Town, criminology students examined the Marais case in seminars on forensic history. Lecturers used it to illustrate how investigative priorities evolve. Slide projectors clicked softly as old photographs appeared on the wall, the misted field, the plaster cast, the labeled envelopes. Students took notes silently. The lecturer emphasized the human dimension. Every line you see on these reports was typed by someone who refused to discard a file. For Anton Marais, public attention brought both gratitude and exhaustion. Journalists left messages on his answering machine daily. He responded to none. Instead, he spent evenings sorting through family belongings. In a box beneath his parents' bed, he found letters Lydia had written to a friend while studying. The handwriting was neat, factual, without sentiment. In one note, she described her daily walk to work, mentioning the buses that ran late during winter rain. The simple domestic details struck him as heavier than any news headline. He donated the letters to the investigating unit for archival preservation. They were scanned and stored with the digital case record. The originals were returned to him in a sealed envelope. When asked later why he had given them away, he said only, "She's already in every line of that file. The paper belongs there." As the first court hearings continued, journalists sought commentary from legal experts. They focused on the significance of evidence continuity and the weight of DNA in retrospective prosecution. Interviews were broadcast with calm, technical analysis rather than sensational tone. Microphones captured the faint hum of courthouse ventilation during recordings. The narrative that emerged in the press was less about tragedy and more about process. the machinery of justice catching up with time. In Claremont's local library, an exhibit was organized by volunteers. It displayed photographs and copies of original newspaper articles under the title "Files That Spoke Again." Visitors walked quietly through the small space. The air smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. A separate board listed dates of unresolved disappearances still awaiting review. The Marais case, now marked solved, served as both example and reminder. Community reactions outside the city were equally reflective. In Worcester, where Nell had lived, neighbors expressed disbelief. They described him as private but courteous, someone who fixed engines for half the town. Yet when confronted with the DNA evidence, most accepted the verdict as inevitable. The contrast between public memory and forensic fact became a central theme in subsequent coverage. Reporters filmed outside his workshop, its metal shutters closed. The still wind pressed against the tin siding as they spoke to camera. Among law enforcement circles, younger officers saw the case as a bridge between eras. The story circulated internally as a lesson in chain of custody. At training sessions, instructors displayed copies of the original evidence seals. The classroom smelled faintly of marker ink as they wrote "Documentation saves evidence" on whiteboards. Each officer received a printed summary of the Marais investigation timeline, from discovery to DNA confirmation. The message was procedural, not emotional. In later interviews, Venter reflected that the case had taught him the value of ordinary precision. "It was never intuition," he said quietly, "only paperwork." His comment summarized an entire philosophy of investigation, that persistence and record accuracy could outweigh even decades of silence. The quote appeared in a policing journal beneath a black-and-white portrait of him taken in his retirement years. The accompanying caption read, "The detective who kept the drawer locked." Public empathy extended briefly to other families whose loved ones had disappeared during the same period. Letters reached the cold case unit from across the country asking whether their cases might also be reopened. Some provided old reference numbers written from memory. Clerks logged each letter carefully, acknowledging receipt. The faint click of keyboards filled the office as they created digital entries for future reference. The Marais file had sparked a wider movement toward reviewing historic unsolved crimes. In 2006, 1 year after the arrest, a formal ceremony recognized Venter and the forensic team for service to cold case resolution. The event was held at police headquarters, attended by senior officers and laboratory staff. A small plaque was presented to Venter, engraved with his name and the inscription, "For preserving truth through time." Applause echoed briefly before fading into respectful silence. He accepted it with a simple nod. Meanwhile, the old evidence site near Pinelands was finally redeveloped. New fencing replaced the rusted wire. The ground was leveled for an industrial extension. Before construction began, workers unearthed a small fragment of plaster, a remnant of the original footprint cast. It was collected by an archaeologist assisting the city survey. The fragment was transferred to the Cape Town Museum of Forensic History. Labeled Artifact from Case 79-317, visitors rarely noticed it among larger exhibits. Yet its presence completed a quiet circle. Years later, the plaque near the railway line still stood. Moss gathered around its base, and the metal had dulled slightly from weather. Commuters passed daily without stopping. But sometimes, on colder mornings, the mist along the Cape Flats hung the same way it had in 1979. The memory of that scene remained, faint, distant but traceable, like the lines of a preserved fingerprint. After 1981, the Marais case entered official dormancy. The file was stored in a metal cabinet at Caledon Square, 2nd floor, beneath hundreds of others labeled by year. Dust in the air softened the edges of the folders. Officers passed the cabinet daily without notice. Its drawer stuck slightly when opened. A quiet mechanical reminder of weight and time. The 1980s in Cape Town were turbulent. Law enforcement resources shifted toward public order management, and homicide divisions shrank. Many detectives from the old serious crimes unit retired or transferred. Younger officers inherited their desks, but not always their cases. Lydia's name appeared only in annual inventory lists, a reference number among thousands. The wind pressed faintly against the cracked window of the archive room. For the Marais family, silence settled in layers. Anton completed his apprenticeship and moved north for work. His parents aged quietly, seldom mentioning Lydia aloud. On anniversaries, they placed a small bunch of flowers on their front step, never at the site, never publicly. The radio in their kitchen played softly each morning, voices filling the gaps words could not. Neighbors recalled that the family seemed kind but withdrawn, the house always neat, curtains drawn early. Inside police headquarters, procedural changes replaced the old paper registers with early microfilm. Some files were transferred to reels, but many, including case 79 to 317, were left in their original boxes. Each sheet bore the imprint of a typewriter ribbon that had long since faded. Technicians handling the conversion noted that the Marais file remained complete and undamaged. That entry, made without comment, preserved its survival. In 1985, the Salt River Mortuary upgraded to new facilities. Storage of historical specimens was limited, and most physical exhibits older than 5 years were slated for disposal. Venter, then assigned to another unit, intervened personally. He wrote a brief note citing possible future forensic use. The letter, filed with the pathology register, ensured the samples were retained in cold storage. Cold air drifted from the open refrigeration door as staff rearranged boxes. The following decade brought administrative reorganization and political change. Old priorities shifted. Many case archives were relocated to Belleville for consolidation. Transport workers lifted box after box into trucks, their numbers checked on clipboard lists. Among them, the Marais evidence container remained intact, its wax seals dull but unbroken. When placed on the new shelf, an archivist initialed the transfer sheet, without realizing it contained the oldest biological samples still viable in the region. For 2 decades, the drawer stayed closed. Occasionally, a clerk performing inventory would lift the lid to confirm the presence of each envelope. The air inside smelled faintly of cardboard and dust. The handwriting on the outer tag, Marais Lydia 79317, remained legible, protected by the dull sheen of dried wax. Paper clips had rusted slightly, leaving faint marks along the edges. The case rested in that condition for almost 20 years. In the community, memory thinned. Those who had lived through 1979 grew older. New residents knew nothing of the field by the tracks. The small plaque erected in later years had not yet been imagined. Life in Claremont changed pace. New bus lines, new shops, new traffic lights. For the few who still remembered Lydia, her story existed only in occasional conversation, softened by time. The silence of routine replaced the urgency of investigation. The 1990s introduced digital indexing, but conversion was uneven. Some records remained physical, others scanned. A technician named Elmarie Stein began a side project to list unconverted homicide cases. She noticed that the Marais file contained original sample seals, something uncommon. She noted it in a spreadsheet under potential for review. The computer's fan whirred quietly as she typed. Without realizing it, she had nudged the file back toward relevance. In 1997, the first small forensic database for South Africa came online. It contained minimal entries, but represented a turning point. Stein proposed transferring legacy evidence for DNA storage. Her supervisor approved only a limited number of cases due to cost. Among them, the Marais sample met all requirements: documented chain of custody, surviving material, and clear identification. The evidence was placed in a temperature-controlled freezer marked historical samples, not to discard. A label printer hummed softly as she fixed a barcode to the plastic box. Outside official corridors, no one knew this preservation had occurred. The Marais family remained unaware. For them, the 1990s passed quietly: work, illness, funerals. By the time of their parents' passing, only Anton remained. He found his mother's diary from 1980 containing a single line under July, still waiting for her. The ink had bled slightly across the paper. He placed the notebook back in the drawer without reading further. In 2001, a circular from the National Forensic Science Services Division requested regional laboratories to list all cases with retrievable biological material. The Belleville archive included the Marais evidence, among fewer than 20 others from the 1970s. The air in the storage room felt cold and dry. A single fluorescent tube flickered above the shelves. A technician photographed each evidence envelope for cataloguing, the first time the case had been visually documented since 1979. Even then, months passed before reanalysis began. Equipment was limited, backlog heavy. The file remained queued under pending testing. Each year's report repeated the same note, "Retain for future methods." The phrase appeared 5 times across 2 decades of annual reviews. It meant the case was never discarded, never closed, only paused by technology. During those years, Venter retired. The cafe was demolished, and the old service path grew over with wild grass. The city expanded. New suburbs emerged. The scene of the crime became unrecognizable. Yet beneath those changes, the small sealed envelopes remained constant. The silence around them was not absence, it was preservation. When the 2000s arrived and the cold case unit was established, the Marais file resurfaced. By then, nearly all original witnesses had moved or passed away. The photographs, chemical reports, and typed pages stood in for memory itself. Footsteps echoed softly in the archive corridor as analysts opened the old cabinet. The paper inside was brittle but intact. Decades of stillness had protected what noise and haste might have lost. The silence that followed those years was not empty. It was structured, layers of routine, of people filing, labeling, preserving without knowing why. It was that quiet endurance that allowed one case from 1979 to cross a generation and meet the science of a new century. Heavy air hung motionless in the storeroom as the lid finally lifted, revealing evidence that had waited half a lifetime to be read again. The breakthrough began quietly, inside a laboratory on the outskirts of Pretoria. Rows of refrigeration units lined the walls, their digital readouts glowing faintly in the dim light. The National Forensic Science Services had recently launched a project to re-examine unsolved murders containing preserved biological evidence. Among the boxes shipped from Belleville sat a single container marked Case 793117, Marais, Lydia. The lettering, faded but legible, carried across decades of storage and routine. Technician Elmarie Stein lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay the sealed paper envelopes, edges brittle but intact. She placed them under a glass enclosure to prevent contamination. Each envelope was logged against its original 1979 entry numbers. The handwriting was still neat and square, the ink slightly faded to brown. When she slit the first seal with a sterile blade, a faint scent of old cardboard rose into the still air. The 2 cigarette butts rested within, preserved precisely as they had been labeled 26 years earlier. Chain of custody forms attached to the evidence were immaculate. Every signature from 1979 onward matched verification samples. Not a single line was missing. That administrative precision, uncommon for the era, made the material legally viable for modern DNA profiling. Forensic analysts often called such cases silent witnesses. They carried no sound, yet everything necessary to speak remained within them. Footsteps echoed softly along the lab floor as technicians moved between benches. Under controlled lighting, Stein began the extraction process. Using microforceps, she transferred trace tobacco remnants into sterile tubes. Reagents hissed faintly as they contacted the samples. The laboratory's sequencer unit was one of only 2 in the country capable of generating full genetic profiles from degraded material. For 2 days, the process continued. Heating, amplification, purification. The hum of machines filled the air. Late on the second evening, the monitor displayed a partial sequence. Male DNA, low quantity, consistent across both cigarette ends. It was enough to create a comparative profile. The data was uploaded into the South African Combined DNA Index system. At that time, the database contained fewer than 15,000 profiles. Matching was slow, performed in batches overnight. When Stein returned the following morning, the terminal screen displayed a single result: no match found. She marked the report as retained for periodic rerun. The file returned to cold storage, but now flagged in the digital system. The silence resumed, measured, methodical, patient. 5 years later, in 2005, technological upgrades allowed a reanalysis of partial sequences. A new kit, optimized for degraded samples, offered the chance to reconstruct missing alleles. The Marais sample was among the first to be selected. Forensic analyst Samuel Kumalo led the team. He had not been born when Lydia died. Yet as he studied the faded handwriting on the envelope, he felt the weight of procedural history, a direct line from one investigator's discipline to another's science. The air inside the lab carried the faint, sterile smell of ethanol. Kumalo's team extracted DNA again, this time from the cigarette filter's cellulose fibers rather than the tobacco. Results appeared within hours, a full male genetic profile, complete and stable. They verified it through replication, using an independent sample from the second cigarette. The profiles matched perfectly. It was the first complete DNA result ever derived from evidence older than 25 years in South African records. Kumalo printed the sequence data, signed each page, and sent it for entry into the national database. The printer's rhythmic sound echoed through the quiet room. Within 48 hours, an alert appeared. A routine upload from the Western Cape's Regional Offender Database contained a near-perfect match. Peter Johannes Nel, 53, registered for a minor assault conviction from 1999 that had included mandatory DNA sampling. The probability of error was 1 in 13 billion. The algorithm highlighted the correspondence in bold red text. Kumalo stared at the screen, aware that a file dormant for generations had just crossed into resolution. Notification procedures followed. The system automatically generated a report to the cold case unit, then based in Belleville. Captain Rihanna Botha received the alert at 07:12 on a Wednesday morning. Outside her office, rain tapped against the windows. She opened the report, reading line by line. The name Nell appeared in both the modern database and the original 1979 witness summaries. She printed the alert and walked down the hall to the commanding officer's office. Within an hour, a small task group was assembled to verify the finding. The confirmation process required meticulous comparison. Investigators retrieved the old file from storage. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink. Venter's name appeared on every early page. His 1981 memo insisting on preservation was included, yellowed but intact. When Botha read it aloud to her team, she noted that one man's attention to record-keeping had made their current work possible. The file was transferred to a secure evidence room for review. Cold air drifted from the open doorway as the boxes were unsealed. Contacting Venter proved easy. He still lived near Stellenbosch, long retired but alert. When Botha called to inform him, he paused for several seconds before responding. "You found him?" he asked quietly. She confirmed. The line remained silent except for a faint hiss. Finally he said, "Then keep the file clean and see it through." He offered no further comment. By the next week, a warrant application had been prepared. Prosecutors reviewed chain of custody documents, verifying signatures and storage logs. Every entry matched sequentially. The 1979 police collection, the 1981 preservation note, the 1997 digital barcode, and the 2005 extraction record. No break existed. It was one of the few cold cases in the country where continuity could be demonstrated without gap. That fact alone made prosecution possible. On a cold morning in August 2005, detectives traveled to Worcester to locate Peter Nell. His workshop sat on the edge of town, surrounded by parked vehicles. awaiting repair. The air smelled of diesel and metal filings. Nell was at his bench, adjusting a carburetor when officers approached. They identified themselves and presented the warrant. He removed his gloves slowly, his hands streaked with grease. The wind pressed against the corrugated iron roof as they read him his rights. He offered no resistance, only asking if he might lock the door behind him. Inside the workshop, tools hung neatly on the wall, arranged by size. On a shelf stood an old photograph of a younger man in a tan work jacket. It matched the description from 1979. The photograph was taken into evidence. Nell was escorted to Cape Town under quiet custody, the drive lasting nearly 2 hours. Neither officer spoke during the journey. The hum of tires on asphalt filled the silence. At headquarters, Nell was placed in an interview room. The tape recorder clicked on. Captain Botha began the formal questioning, following procedure line by line. Nell denied knowing Lydia Marais. He admitted smoking Texan plain cigarettes in the 1970s, but insisted he had quit before the incident. When confronted with the DNA report, he frowned slightly but said nothing. The sound of a distant door closing echoed through the corridor. After 2 hours, he requested a lawyer. The interview ended without confession. While legal counsel reviewed the charges, forensic teams rechecked every stage of the analysis to ensure admissibility. The 1979 sample, still held under refrigeration, was photographed with modern digital equipment. Each label, signature, and seal was documented. 2 independent laboratories confirmed the DNA result. Their reports, printed on new letterhead, were attached to the old file like layers of sediment linking eras together. The faint smell of printer toner filled the room as pages stacked on the clerk's desk. Venter, now 70, was invited to witness the evidence review. He arrived in a dark coat carrying his original notebook. Inside the laboratory, he stood quietly as technicians explained the process. The overhead lights reflected off stainless steel benches. "It's the same matchbox," he murmured, recognizing his handwriting. The moment was neither triumphant nor emotional, only factual closure reached through procedure. Cold air moved softly from the ventilation duct as he watched the analysis continue. In September 2005, prosecutors formally charged Nell with murder. The indictment was filed at the Cape Town High Court. Photographers waited outside, their cameras clicking in the damp morning light. Nell was led through the corridor, head slightly bowed, saying nothing. Reporters described him as calm, expression neutral. Inside, the charge was read. He entered a plea of not guilty. The trial date was set for early 2006. The reactivation of the case drew renewed public interest. Television news aired brief clips of the forensic lab, showing only gloved hands and sealed evidence bags. Viewers heard about the persistence of record-keeping that had made the result possible. Radio commentators discussed how advances in science could reopen history. In community halls, families of other missing persons gathered to ask whether their loved ones' files might still contain answers. The sound of chairs shifting on tiled floors echoed as meetings adjourned. Behind the scenes, investigators continued their methodical work. They reconstructed Nell's employment records, vehicle ownership, and travel history. Payroll logs confirmed he had been assigned to track maintenance in 1979, granting him direct access to the area where Lydia's body was found. A colleague from that period remembered Nell returning late from a shift one evening, his jacket damp and his demeanor withdrawn. The colleague had not reported it then. It seemed trivial. He provided a statement now, nearly 30 years later, hands shaking slightly as he signed the page. Laboratory reports established that soil particles from Nell's boots, preserved for testing at his 2005 arrest, contained trace elements matching the railside sediment at Pinelands. Though not definitive, the finding reinforced spatial correlation. Combined with the DNA evidence, it formed a comprehensive evidentiary picture. Prosecutors prepared witness lists and forensic exhibits. Each document was numbered sequentially, forming a chain of precision as structured as the one that had preserved the case itself. For the investigative team, the days before trial were consumed by logistics. They reviewed transcripts, verified timestamps, and rehearsed testimony. In the evenings, the building grew quiet except for the sound of photocopiers. Outside, wind moved gently through the parking lot trees. The atmosphere was not celebratory, but measured, a professional calm that accompanies the completion of a long, methodical journey. When the news of Nell's arrest reached the national media, it was framed less as a story of guilt and more as one of endurance. The headline in the Cape Times read, "DNA links Worcester mechanic to 1979 murder." Subheadings emphasized forensic preservation and historical investigation. Readers commented on how long persistence could outlast memory. Forensic experts appeared on television, explaining the importance of chain of custody and the legal thresholds that evidence must survive. Each word echoed the principles Venter had written decades before in simple ink. The night before the first hearing, Botha visited the evidence locker one last time. She signed the access register, lifted the old envelope from its container, and held it under the dim light. The handwriting from 1979 was still legible. Beside it, a modern barcode sticker glowed faintly. Two systems, separated by decades, met on a single sheet of paper. She returned it carefully to its case and locked the cabinet. The click of the latch echoed in the quiet corridor. Across town, Venter sat in his living room, listening to the evening news. The report mentioned the upcoming trial, quoting unnamed sources about the strength of DNA evidence. He turned down the volume and stared at the small folder he still kept. Photocopies of his early notes, photographs of the locket, the plaster cast. The room was silent except for the slow tick of a clock. He thought of how time could hold both loss and order in the same file. In that silence, decades of persistence converged. A technician's careful labeling, a detective's insistence on preservation, a clerk's routine signature. No moment alone had solved the case. It was the collective discipline of ordinary work. As the city outside prepared for morning, the file that had once gathered dust now stood at the center of justice. Proof that quiet diligence can survive the noise of years. The trial of State versus Peter Johannes. Nell began in March 2006 at the Cape Town High Court. The courtroom sat beneath tall windows that filtered in muted daylight. Journalists filled the benches near the back. Each day began the same way. The clerk's voice calling the docket, the scrape of chairs, the brief murmur of counsel arranging files. Cold air drifted through the corridor whenever the heavy doors opened. Prosecutor Advocate Marlene Jacobs presented the case with measured clarity. She began not with emotion but with documentation, photographs, typed memos, chain of custody logs. Each exhibit was projected on a screen. The original crime scene photograph, the locket, the plaster cast, the evidence envelopes. The hum of the projector filled the silence as she recited case numbers and dates. Her narrative moved through time exactly as the file had: 1979, 1981, 1997, 2005. The story itself became proof of diligence. The defense conceded the authenticity of the evidence, but challenged its interpretation. Nell's attorney argued that the cigarette butts could have been discarded earlier, long before the crime. He emphasized the lack of eyewitnesses and absence of confession. The courtroom remained still as the defense questioned the reliability of decades-old documentation. Yet each question returned to the same obstacle: the unbroken chain of custody verified by multiple signatures. In a system built on procedure, paperwork became witness. When the forensic expert took the stand, she explained the preservation method in precise technical language. DNA extraction, amplification, sequencing, each stage outlined step by step. She described the original wax seals, the refrigeration process, and the digital indexing introduced years later. The judge nodded occasionally, taking notes. The air smelled faintly of paper and polish. Every sound, the tap of pens, the rustle of legal robes, seemed amplified by the stillness. Venter was called as a witness on the third day. He walked slowly to the stand, his dark coat buttoned against the chill. His testimony lasted less than an hour. He confirmed that he had collected the cigarette butts and ordered their preservation. When asked why, he replied, "Because we didn't have the science then, but we would someday." His words carried no pride, only logic. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds after he stepped down. Footsteps echoed as he left through the side door. Midway through the proceedings, the defense introduced an argument about possible contamination. They suggested that laboratory conditions in 1979 were inadequate for modern standards. The prosecution countered with testimony from the preservation technician, who detailed the procedures used to maintain sterility during reanalysis. She noted that the DNA profile matched on both cigarette ends, collected separately, minimizing any chance of transfer. Her tone remained steady, her phrases exact. The judge listened intently, his fingers interlaced on the bench. After 3 weeks of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. Advocate Jacobs summarized the evidence as a continuum of discipline. She concluded simply, "The paper remained intact, and so did the truth it contained." The defense offered no alternate suspect, only the passage of time. When proceedings ended for the day, the courtroom emptied slowly. The echo of footsteps and the creak of wooden benches lingered as the judge announced he would deliver judgment within a week. On April 14, 2006, the verdict was read. The courtroom filled before dawn. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The judge entered, robes trailing, and spoke without preamble. He found Peter Johannes Nell guilty of murder. He cited the consistency of the DNA evidence and the flawless record of custody as decisive. His voice remained even as he noted that time does not erase accountability. Nell showed no visible reaction. He was sentenced to life imprisonment under current statutes. Outside, reporters gathered beneath umbrellas, dictating notes into recorders. The story traveled quickly through local and national outlets. 1979 Murder Solved by DNA, read one headline. Another described it as justice delayed, not denied. The tone was restrained, factual. For most readers, it was not about shock but closure, an administrative success that restored meaning to long-kept records. The wind pressed gently against the courthouse doors as they closed behind the departing crowd. In the months following the verdict, the case became part of police training curricula. Recruits studied the Marais file to understand how preservation could transcend generations. In a small lecture hall at the police academy, an instructor held up a replica evidence bag and explained how a single act of labeling could one day reopen a case. The air smelled faintly of chalk and paper. Behind him, projected slides displayed the faded handwriting of the original 1979 envelope. The message was simple: routine diligence saves lives. At the Forensic Science Services Laboratory, technicians compiled a report titled Lessons from the Marais Investigation. It outlined chain of custody standards, refrigeration protocols, and data management. Each page carried the case number as a reference point. The report was distributed across all regional branches. In later years, it became a foundation for the creation of South Africa's centralized cold case evidence retention policy. Quiet administrative reform grew from one detective's caution. For Anton Marais, the verdict ended legal uncertainty, but not memory. He returned home to Claremont, where the house now felt larger and emptier. He placed the locket beside framed photographs of his parents. The sound of rain on the roof filled the room. He told a journalist months later that he had no anger, only a sense that the file has gone back to sleep. His words captured the subdued tone of resolution that surrounded the case. No celebration, only stillness. Venter attended the plaque ceremony held near the former railway siding later that year. The site had changed, fenced and industrialized, but a small area of grass remained. The plaque read, Lydia Marais, 1958-1979, Justice Found Through Preservation. Cold wind pressed against the aluminum as the group stood in silence. Venter placed a small notebook beside the plaque, the same one he had carried since 1979. Then he turned and walked away slowly, his footsteps fading on the gravel. Inside the archives at Belleville, the Marais file was returned to its box. Technicians resealed each envelope, attaching new documentation summarizing the case closure. The folder was labeled, "Finalized, retain indefinitely." The room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning unit. Dust drifted lazily in the fluorescent light. The cabinet door closed softly, the sound echoing through the still air. In academic circles, criminologists began referencing the case as a model for procedural endurance. Papers cited its cross-generational continuity and the administrative chain as instrument of justice. Forensic journals included it alongside international examples of delayed resolution. The tone remained analytical, avoiding sentiment. It became an institutional story rather than a personal one, evidence that structure itself could carry moral weight. 10 years later, the Cold Case Unit established a small museum, exhibit in Cape Town. Among photographs and instruments from historic investigations sat a single display, labeled Case 79317, the Marais file. Inside, the glass case rested replicas of the evidence envelopes, a copy of Venter's memo, and the repaired locket donated by Anton before his death. Visitors moved quietly past. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. The exhibit offered no drama, only documentation. Outside that building, the city continued to grow. Traffic hummed along the highways that had once been gravel roads. Few who passed the museum knew the story behind the case number etched on the label. Yet within archives and classrooms, its presence endured, a reminder that patience, method, and the careful closing of drawers could one day deliver truth. Years after Venter's passing, his notebook was discovered among his personal effects. On the final page, he had written a single sentence: "Paper remembers what people forget." The line was later engraved on a plaque in the forensic archive where the Marais evidence still rests. Cold air drifted through the corridor as technicians walked past, unaware of how much their routine owed to that principle. Each morning, the archive lights flicker on. Rows of metal cabinets stand in quiet alignment, each containing hundreds of forgotten names. Among them, Case 79317 remains filed under resolved. Its papers are thin, its labels fading, but every mark of ink carries the memory of persistence. The locket, the matchbox, the typed reports, all fragments of diligence surviving their makers. Heavy silence fills the room, steady and unbroken. The story of Lydia Marais ends not with revelation, but with order. A field once covered in mist, a drawer once gathering dust, a file that outlasted generations. Each became part of a single continuum. Justice arrived not through chance, but through the discipline of those who refused to discard the past. The city around that field may have changed, but somewhere within its archives, the evidence remains, resting quietly beneath the hum of fluorescent light.